Hi, I'm Harry Fletcher-Wood. I'm an Associate Dean at Ambition Institute. We are an education charity focused on helping teachers and school leaders to keep getting better, especially those who are working in the most disadvantaged communities. We run professional development programs at every career stage, from new teachers all the way up to multi-academy trust CEOs. And this year, hopefully for 1 year only, we're running the Summer Series, a program of webinars throughout the summer term to support you during the coronavirus pandemic. This webinar is designed around a question I was asked by a head teacher right at the beginning of the lockdown. How are we going to meet students' differing needs when schools reopen? Some students may have learned a lot, some may have learned very little. How do we find out who knows what? And what do we do once we've done that? To answer that question, I've talked to 3 people who I find really inspiring, each of whom brings a different perspective. The first is Daisy Christodoulou, Director of Education at No More Marking and author of the brilliant book about assessment, Making Good Progress. I'll be talking to her about the key ideas teachers and school leaders need to consider when thinking about assessment. I'm then going to talk to Janice head teacher at Falinge Park High School in Rochdale. It was Janice who posed this question that I began with, and so I'll be talking through possible solutions with her based on Daisy's ideas. And thirdly, I wanted to get a primary perspective, so I talked to Jo Riley. I know Jo because she's on our Teacher Education Fellows programme. I'll talk more about that at the end. But her day job is head teacher of Randal Cremer Primary School in East London. To finish with, we'll take a look ahead and I'll share a few ideas from John Etty, Director of Teaching and Learning at a school in New Zealand, which reopened to pupils last week. The interesting thing about today's webinar, among many things, is I pre-recorded the interviews you're going to hear. And the nice thing about that is means I can answer your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, as the interviews are going. And in between each interview, I'm going to discuss a few of the points raised, both by the speaker, but also any really important questions that you introduce. But I'll start with Daisy. Daisy is one of the smartest people I know about education in general and assessment in particular. Beyond that, I'm going to let her introduce herself.
I'm Daisy Christodoulou. I am the Director of Education at No More Marking. And at No More Marking, we provide online comparative judgment assessments. So that's one of my interests in assessment. I used to be a secondary school English teacher, and I've written the book Making Good Progress, which is all about doing assessment better.
What 3 things would you want every teacher and every leader to know about assessment?
So I think the first thing would be to think about purpose, which is to say that there's really no such thing almost as like a good or a bad assessment. There's assessments that are well designed for a purpose and badly designed for a purpose. So you can have an assessment that's, let's give an example, absolutely brilliant at telling you if a student is able to answer word problems in mathematics. And it will be really well designed at telling you that. If you try and assume from a student doing badly on that assessment that they are not very good at maths, that might be that's actually not a legitimate kind of inference to make from that, because the assessment hasn't been designed to do that. It may well just be that the student has poor English, they're an English language learner, and they're actually great at maths, but the word problems they really struggled with. So that's just a really simple example of how you can have a test that's really well designed for one purpose, doesn't suit another. And so the key thing when you're looking at any assessment is to think, what is the purpose of this assessment? Is it well designed for that purpose? And following on from that, another way of thinking about that is just to think about inferences. What are the inferences you want to make? Does this test allow you to make those inferences, or actually is it not designed for that? And again, following on from that, I think one of the problems we have in assessment is that we want tests to fulfill lots of different purposes. And my argument is that there's no test that can fulfill every purpose under the sun. If you're optimizing for one, you're inevitably trading off against another purpose. So that would be my first thing, purposes. The second thing, following on from that, would be about formative and summative assessment. So 2 of the big purposes we think about a lot in assessment are formative purposes of assessment and summative purposes. And I think it's very hard to get an assessment that does both perfectly. You can get one that does a little bit of both. You can get one that does one perfectly and one badly, the other one perfectly, one badly, but to get one that does both perfectly, very, very difficult. So I would say for those 2 purposes which we're really interested in, I would think about just doing them differently. In terms of formative assessment, for me, formative assessment is all about helpful next steps. It's all about what do you want to do what do you want to find out from the assessment that is going to tell you what the student should do next, what you should do next? And so often for those, you want quite micro assessments. You want things that are quite specific, that are giving you quite fine-grained information. Summative assessment, by contrast, often what we're concerned with is we want a shared meaning. We want some kind of meaning that goes beyond our school, goes beyond our context, that it has a wider meaning. And to do that, often you need a bigger assessment that's assessing a more complex skill, that is often a bit inflexible because you have to make sure your students are doing it in the same conditions as everybody else to get that shared meaning. So that's just one way where you're thinking about two very important purposes. Both are very important, but it's very hard to get an assessment to do both well. They pull in different directions. So I would say, second thing, think really carefully about summative and formative and how you want to do those differently. The third thing I would talk about is think about the sample of an assessment and the domain of an assessment. So the other thing to remember with any assessment is it can never actually assess the entirety of what it is you want your students to have learned or to be able to do. All an assessment ever does is sample. It will sample a portion of kind of the wider domain. And a nice analogy which a lot of assessment experts will use is to compare it almost to an opinion poll. That an opinion poll is sampling just 1,000 people and their opinions and trying to scale that up to get you a picture of how 40 million people think. It's the same with an assessment. You're getting a student who sits down maybe for 2 hours on an afternoon in June, and you are trying to then use that information to allow you to find out something about how they might perform a couple of months, years into the future, and also to understand how they perform not just on the subset of questions on that exam, but on the wider domain of that entire subject. So the reason why it's important to remember that is if you forget that, you end up thinking, well, if my student just answers all these questions on the exam right, that's it, job done. And obviously, actually, it isn't. There are ways you can answer all the questions on the exam correctly, but still not really have the wider inference that you want from it. Now, the most obvious way you break the link between the sample and the domain is cheating. But there are ways you can compromise that link that aren't just out and out cheating. There are things like gaming, where you target your instruction very narrowly to the types of questions that are on the exam. And neglect kind of other things that are important but are not on the exam. And so there are all these kind of insidious ways of compromising the link between the sample and the domain, which really then compromise the information we get from the exam.
So I'm a school leader, or I'm a head of department. I'm reopening my school after a long period of time that I've not seen my students. They've had varying degrees of engagement. What should I do? What should I prioritise? And how do these principles apply to my situation?
So I think the first thing, again, think about purposes. I'd probably, in any school, primary or secondary, distinguish between those students who are starting the school and those students who are, and have been at the school. So from a secondary perspective, I think some kind of year 7 baseline. And obviously a lot of schools will have some kind of year 7 baseline anyway, but I think that will become more important given that SATs aren't there. Similarly with year 12, if you're taking in new students in year 12, that might be something to be thinking about there as well. And even if you're not taking in students in year 12, it might be nice even for the 11s that you know as they're starting a new course to be doing some kind of baseline there. So I think baseline for students who are either new to the school or starting a new course is going to be even more important. I think those baselines, probably there's an element of kind of you just want to get some kind of big picture in year 7, probably of English and maths. I think at primary you'd be thinking something similar at junior, year 3. Obviously reception is different again for those students who are always new and there is no prior attainment there, but you'd be looking at whatever it is you're doing there as well. That probably won't change as much. So that's one thing, the new students. I think then the other thing you want to do is for returning students is to be probably thinking about some way of trying to capture those learning losses and gains that will have happened over this time. And that's where, so if I'm thinking about the year 7 baseline, I'm thinking that's probably going to be something relatively kind of big picture, maths, reading, those kinds of assessments. Whereas I think there's a potential to be doing something with the returning students that's subject specific, that is looking at actual curriculum content that they've studied, that's trying to get an idea of what they've lost, what they might need reinforcement, consolidation on. Again, if I'm just thinking about year 10, then I'd be thinking, well, perhaps the year 10's coming into year 11. Where have you got up to in, say, your literature text? how much of that literature text do they remember? Now, obviously, you're probably always expecting a little bit of decay over the summer, but like how much more? So I'm thinking for those year groups, like something more specific in the subject-specific content. And so if we go back to my previous distinction about summative and formative, I guess I'm thinking with the baselines, you want something that's more on that summative end that is giving you a shared meaning. I think with the returning students, the subject-specific stuff, you're looking for something a bit more formative that is giving you an idea of next steps, like what to do next. So I think that would be the balance there for me. And I think similarly at primary, you'll be looking at trying to work out where those gaps are for the sort of real subject-specific content that you've taught, trying to just get a formative handle on what do they remember, what have they lost. Perhaps also on top of that, getting some kind of summative sort of shared meaning for the reading and the maths of seeing, well, where are they, how are they stacking up relative to other students, how are they stacking up relative to the national picture. Obviously, complicating the factor is that the national picture, everyone's in the same boat. So, and we are facing this at No More Marking with some of the work we're doing, which is that, normally we would assume certain progressions on average. And what we're realising, obviously, is, we can't sort of take those for granted in the way that we would have done. And so in a sense, like a really important thing for us and for schools as well is just to get a handle on like what has been lost, both at that subject specific level and also at that wider level of summative, learning gains and losses. They are.
Is there anything you would recommend that head teachers or heads of department don't do? What should they avoid? Again, I'm not sure there's anything new I'd say here, but I would say, always there have been issues with assessment where people, I think, do things for the sake of doing things. They do things for Ofsted. They do things because other people are doing them. And I know it's hard to avoid that pressure. I know what that's like. I think there's even more of that around now at the minute because we're all in a time of uncertainty and there is an element of, well, my goodness, if everyone else is doing that, I'd better do it too. So I totally understand that. But, I guess to some extent to try and, stay true to your principles and don't be rushed into doing things because other people are doing them, and definitely not to be rushed into things where I think maybe there's like a big workload implication. There were loads of good things I thought in the few moments I had with Daisy. It only remains for me to plug both her preceding book, Making Good Progress, which is one of the best books that I've ever read about assessment, and the new one, which we've got on screen, but I've also got here because I've just started reading myself, which presciently she decided to write a book about EdTech a year and a half ago, presumably anticipating the situation we were now going to find ourselves in. Highly recommend both of them. But to come back to what she was talking about, I think the biggest single takeaway or the thing that I want to hold on to from that is that let's be really clear about what we're going to do in response to this test. What's it for? And thinking about, okay, it's guiding us in next steps. So there's a temptation potentially on reopening a school to say, I want to know about all the things that we taught the kids ever and all the things we wanted them to do over the holidays. So let's say, for the sake of argument, I set a 100 question quiz, which is going to include all of those, and I get students to answer that 100 question quiz. I now have to mark this 100 question quiz. Once I've marked it, presumably I have to do something with it, and that actually I'm sort of creating a rod for my own back there. It probably is more helpful to think, okay, what are my options as a teacher, as a middle leader, as a senior leader? I'm not going to be sending students into one-to-one tutoring in order to make sure they catch up what they individually need. So what are the most important things I can pick out? And maybe that means I've just got a 5-question quiz or a 1-question answer. But those 5 questions are going to be 5 things they absolutely have to know on entering year 9 or whatever it is. And I can then use that information to say, well, 3/4 of the students really struggle with question 3. I'm going to put in 3 weeks booster mini module on that topic. Had some really good questions from various participants. Do keep those coming in the Q&A in the bottom, but we are going to come back to most of them. So I had questions about soft skills, how we would assess for those, and some of the practicalities. And the best way to deal with the practicalities is to go back to a head teacher who's facing them. So what the person we're going to hear from next is Janice Allen, who's the head teacher who posed that initial question that I opened with.
Yeah, so I'm a head teacher at a secondary school in Rochdale in the northwest of England. It's a large school, large multicultural school, very inclusive school, high area of deprivation. So if I take what Daisy's just said, being really clear about the purpose of what I'm doing, I suppose I'm trying to find out how much the children have grasped the core knowledge and practiced the subject-specific skills during lockdown.
I think so, but I think what you're saying to me sounds like actually the purpose is to know how you're going to differentiate for a really wildly different, diverse set of sort of results that or things that have happened for these students over the intervening few months. So maybe before we think about assessment design, we have to think about, like, if we do think, let's imagine three pupils. Pupil A, who was coming into school all through the lockdown, key worker child, has maybe learnt a load of new stuff. Pupil B, who has sort of done a bit of revision as they've gone along, and then pupil C, who for whatever reason hasn't been able to engage with anything, and effectively potentially hasn't done any formal learning for the whole time that schools have been closed. Do you want them to be in 3 different classrooms? Do you want all of pupil A's to be in an extension group? Do you think that the social side of learning is more important and A, B and C should just be mixed up? Like, where do you stand on that, both philosophically and practically?
Yeah, so if we go back a little bit, I think I've probably done what we always do as teachers, which is perhaps jump to the doing. So what's this assessment going to look like, as opposed to actually thinking of what the purpose of that will be. So as a school leader, my priority is about the emotional well-being of the children coming back in. And I think it's important to say that because that is a priority. There is also a priority as well in terms of helping the children to make up for any gaps or know where they are to be able to move on to the next aspects of the curriculum. So if we were to think about what that would look like, I think there may have to be, the curriculum might have to look different initially for children coming back. Perhaps then I can actually find out how much children have done during that time while we've been off. Then perhaps what I can take from there is, right, so I need to understand exactly where they're up to now, and I need to decide the purpose of the assessment, don't I? I need to understand, what I'm trying to get from this. And as you say, is it 3 lots of information? Yeah, it's an interesting question. So taking that into consideration, what you just said, I think priority 1 has to be the emotional well-being of the kids coming back, knowing where they are. But equally as well, I have got to find out where they are in their learning. And as a school leader, I've got to be able to give the tools to my staff to be able to do that. So I think perhaps discussing with my teachers what any assessment, what the purpose would be of that assessment is really important.
Janice and I discussed the potential for some kind of recovery curriculum to bridge the gap between where students were when schools closed and where we would have wanted them to be when schools reopened in a normal year. And then I asked her who was going to be designing the assessments that would tell us what students needed for that recovery curriculum.
I think actually a team of subjects, a team of teachers together. And one of the things we've been really keen on in terms of lockdown is obviously the teachers have been connecting quite a lot with each other. And but if it was to take me as the head and I said, right, we're going to do it this way. Well, I'm not a specialist in science. I'm not a specialist in maths. I can do it in English. But actually, I don't know what is best for children. My teachers know what is best for those children. So perhaps they could work together to come up with some way that's not, necessarily just kids sat in silence doing exams as soon as they come back, but somewhat sensible way to find out what the children have learned during this time, or how much they've been able to draw out the curriculum constructs from the past. So I think it sits within subject teams to be able to design and develop something in that way. And then that means that my role and my role of senior leaders is to be able to support them by giving them the time to be able to do that.
One thing that Daisy suggested is separating out the tests for summative and formative purposes. And so I think it is a departmental thing of saying it's not, if you're going into year 10, it's not one GCSE question, because we know that's just sampling a narrow bit of the whole, everything you want students to know. It is a team effort to work out what are all the things we've taught students in years 7, 8 and 9 that we really think they need to remember to access year 10. And yeah, that logically it's very hard for one individual in a subject team to do that. And okay, let's try and make this super concrete then. You're drafting the email to your subject teams. Well, I mean, let's assume for these purposes it's going to be week 1. It's just going to be sort of rebuilding routines, rebuilding relationships. It's going to be week 2. How long are you going to give them? When's it going to be marked? How many questions should be on it? And obviously, as you've said, that's a subject-specific question, but you're going to need to work out the timetabling and so on. So what are you thinking about that?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to the purpose of it, doesn't it? And and where we find ourselves, because we could find ourselves that we've only got half a year group back. We bring year 10 back, I might only have half of those back. Right, so, well, we need to provide space for the children and staff to come back together. That's really important. We haven't, as a school, we haven't expected a huge amount, in terms of what children should and shouldn't be doing, because contextually as well, we know that there are issues around that. But this is where the work in the curriculum comes into its own. We've built over the past 4 years a really strong curriculum which builds on misconceptions each time and gives pupils the opportunity through recall, quizzing at the start of lessons, start of what units, to be able to draw out their knowledge from year 7, 8 and 9. So if we're taking year 10. So quite a lot of those assessments are part and parcel of our practice. And maybe what we do is we just go back to some of the things that we've done previously, rather than reinventing the wheel and having to have the staff rewrite, a whole load of assessments. We go back to some of those things that we've done previously, perhaps where we've known where children have struggled, because as teachers, our teachers keep all that information. Our teachers know our pupils the best. Perhaps we're able to go back to some of those things that we've done and perhaps just use those questions in a different way. So, for example, if we were to take a concept that was in science, it might well be that we just say, right, we've asked a question like this previously, pupils have worked on. Why don't we take that question and just try and shift some of the wording around, put it in a different context, so it's giving the pupils opportunity to practice and apply their skills in a different area.
I was going to ask you about sustainability, and I think that sounds like a really good way around it, of like, don't go and go back to your unit tests, go back to the stuff that's in the curriculum, and don't feel like you have to work from scratch. Shall I push you a little bit? Are they going to get an hour? They're going to get 45 minutes? Are you going to give them a bonus period? Who's going to mark it and when? What's going on?
Yeah, so you can push me in, and the answer is part of that whole unknowns, isn't it? So I'm thinking, I don't even know whether my children are coming back for a full day.
Yeah.
Fatigue, the way that you have to feed them every dinner time, if we can only fit 40 kids in the dining room, all of those logistics are, if we come back after half term, all of those logistics are going to have to come into play. So much as I hate this, logistics in some way are going to have to drive the learning. And I think that's a situation that we find ourselves in. But I would anticipate that you would be setting something that you would be expecting the pupils to focus on for 45 minutes to an hour, maybe once a day. But again, that's something I'd have to think about. So who would mark it? Well, I would hope that actually our teams are strong enough to be able to get this information in, and then for the teachers of that child to be able to mark it, because that's what's important, isn't it? It's about that teacher's going to have that kid the following year. If you take 10 into 11, they need to know where they're up to so that they can tailor the learning or the approach for when they come back.
And is there any advice that you think you might give them once they've looked at all these tests about that tailoring?
Yeah, well, this goes back to my original question, isn't it? Do you reteach the material for all those kids who haven't got it, or do you say that we've got to move on? And I think that at our school, we know that you can't cover the whole of the syllabus, and so you have to decide what is particularly important. I think that what I would be expecting my teachers to do, which is what we do now, is look for some big misconceptions of the kids. So where is it where the majority of children haven't understood this concept? And then there might be some reteaching of that. But some things we might just have to say, right, okay, we'll move on. We don't know what's going to happen with exams next year, but we're just going to have to move on. I think if we're framing it in that sort of formative assessment, they don't have to be high stakes, these tests in some ways, do they? They are questions. We're eliciting feedback. We're eliciting from the children what it is that they know, which is what we do on a day-to-day basis with kids when we ask them questions. Keeping it as sort of, right, this is to help you. This isn't this isn't an opportunity to say, right, well, we're going to move you up or move you down. This is just to find out where you're up to. Because, as I said to you before, a third of our children don't have internet access. They get their internet access on their parents' phones or on, Wi-Fi hotspots.
Yeah. So we're trying to be fair to them and recognising that there's all sorts of different stuff going on in their households. Yeah, we're trying to take account of that. I've got one more question, which is a kind of like sense check of everything we've talked about. But is there anything else? Are there any details that we've not talked about that you think we should have done that we need to think about?
Yeah, so there's just one thing that's been in my mind, and I think I've mentioned it to you before. During this lockdown, we've been saying as a senior leadership team, is our good enough? And what I mean by that is it's such difficult circumstances that we know that whatever we do when we go back isn't going to be perfect. And, and actually teaching isn't perfection. That's what is so beautiful about it, isn't it? It's messy, it's complex. And leading a school is messy and complex, and I love that. And so what we have to say is, are we really clear about what it is that we want? Are we really clear about how this is going to help the children in the future? And I think if we are, and we do our very best, then that good enough is enough.
Yeah. So that's the higher level of purpose, right? Is that and the emotional well-being. So when you're messaging that to your teachers, it's like, this is what we're going to do, and this is the why, and this is the why of the why. And I think there's a really nice blend of realism and idealism in what you said there. So my last question is a Gary Klein question. It's this pre-mortem of how you pick out the things that are going to stump you. So it's Christmas, schools have reopened, your teachers are back, your kids are back, the dining hall works magically, but the assessments haven't had the effect that you were hoping they would have. Something's gone wrong. Why? What's gone wrong?
And that is a tough question, isn't it? Why might they have gone wrong? We might have been trying to do too much with them. We might have been trying to see it as a right, we need these assessments because if the same thing happens next year, we need evidence what our children have achieved. We might have not created the conditions in the classroom for these to be reliable. We might have tried to introduce new questions that they haven't been taught. So, I'm very much that in mocks, I say to the staff, you do not put questions in the mocks that they haven't been taught. This is not about this. This is about making sure, assessing what the children have learned so far. And I think it would, if anything, it would have been because we've been probably trying to do too much and fill everything in and try and fill those gaps. This obsession, there's rhetoric I'm starting to hear now about like filling the gaps. Well, it goes back to what I said about good enough is enough. We will do the very best that we can. Things that might have gone wrong, in terms of the well-being of the children, the particular context they find themselves in, all of those will play a part, thinking in if everything's gone wrong.
Thank you again for your questions as they come in. We had a lovely comment from Gabrielle who just said, this just really shows you need to support the head teacher. And if you've been looking at the teacher tap findings in terms of anxiety, what they're showing is that head teacher at the moment, for most teachers, obviously not all, anxiety is lower than normal, but head teachers, every time there's a new announcement, head teachers' anxiety goes like that. So if you're on the call and not a head teacher, be nice to head teachers, please. And the other thing that I thought was really nice about the comments that she's making, that Janice, the head teacher, was making there, was the way she was saying, look, I'm going to rely on the support of my department in order to make this work. The other thing I should say in terms of framing is the way that conversation was set up. None of us sort of are pretending here that we have all the answers, and the goal is more to work through the things that the situation that we face. I thought Janice made loads of really useful points, but a couple of ones to highlight. One of them was sort of two connected points, like use what you've already got. Like the stuff that we're teaching students remains, the curriculum remains the same. Our students, barring the experience they've just had, remain more or less the same. Keep it simple, don't do extra stuff. If you've got interim assessments that work, if you've got a curriculum framework that shows the stuff you really care about and the misconceptions students have, just reuse those assessments. And then tied to that, this idea that, you know, like this is kind of just what we do. So again, if you're a senior leader or a middle leader, messaging that, like, look, you know, everyone's going to be out of the habit, students are going to be out of the habit, teachers are going to be out of the habit, but what we're asking you to do is go back to the things that you're really good at and you've always been doing, is probably both a powerful and an encouraging message. Alongside, so having talked to Janice, I wanted to see the similarities and the differences between what she described in a secondary school and the situation in a primary school. So to do that, I talked to a brilliant primary school head teacher who we'll go to now.
I'm Jo Riley. I'm head teacher of a primary school in Hackney. It's a 2-form entry school, and it's right by Hoxton Station. So it's got high free school meals, and it's very much in English as additional language is very common. And we've got very complex special needs children as well, and lots of families with complex lives that obviously the lockdown's really impacted, but that's the sort of school it is.
What are your priorities more broadly as a head when you reopen the school, and hopefully your pupils come flooding in? What are the one or two things you want your staff to be thinking about most?
The children's well-being, not just their mental well-being, their physical well-being. We're very aware that a lot of our children haven't been outside the door for 7 weeks already. I went and saw a little boy the other day, and he's put on so much weight because he's just not going out at all. I'm trying not to use the word physical social distancing anymore because I think it's really negative. So we're trying to use the term physical distancing. But how we do that in a primary school where it's so much around PSHE and getting the children just need hugs and cuddles and stuff like that. So we want to bring joy into it as well. We don't want it just to be, we've all been through a really bad time. We need to find a way of laughing together as well. And one of my big ideas was about using singing a lot, but then all the research is showing that singing's maybe not so good to do because it's about breathing out and all that stuff. But I'm sure if they're 2 meters apart and singing,
get a choir together on the playground or something like that.
Yeah,
and everyone
do a Maccaton choir or something.
Yeah.
But and I think it's just got to be around, and it's not going to be about hot housing and children catching up, because the last thing they need is to suddenly be back in school and just doing maths and English because they've missed out on maths. You know, it'll be a lot of speaking and listening, a lot of language and vocabulary work, so that they've got the language to themselves and say what they're thinking. And trying to work out what the gaps are, which children have been accessing work online, which children have been doing the written work, and which children have done nothing, and trying to get our heads around that, really.
What sort of things are you going to tell your colleagues that you'd like them to think about as they're trying to assess those gaps for your children?
I think the thing for me is one of the things that I want the teachers to be assessing is the children's attitudes to learning more than their actual knowledge. So it's going to be, I don't know if you've come across them. In early years, they use something called the Leuven scales, and it's all to do with children, how long they can concentrate on a task, how independent they are. And I think the way that we're going to have to change our teaching to meet physical distancing and things like that, it's about, what I'd like in the first few weeks is teachers to be actually really looking at how independent children are, how if they make a mistake, can they go and correct it themselves, how can they assess their own work and things like that. So more than the academic side of things, really, it'll be the attitudes to learning and the attitudes to studying that we'll be really looking at. And I want to do it in a kind of early years way where it's more observational rather than children sitting and doing a test.
And I guess there's a sense in which, as well as missing the time in the classroom and what they might have learned, they've gotten out of the habit of sitting and concentrating, or all the good habits you're trying to get them into.
It's even the language they use, Harry. The language they use. We work a lot on. Our reading programme is built about giving children sort of sentence stems that help them to think academically. And I've done a lot of work with Tower Hamlet's EAL project, which is about the academic language children need to be successful in the UK. And they would have used that language for months. Yeah. So that's what I want to be assessing, is what do they remember about how to talk about their learning? How do they, because we can do some, but with some of the older children, we'll probably do some standardised tests or anything just to see where the gaps in the curriculum are for, in my dream world, we won't have SATs for at least another 2 years, if ever again.
Let's come back to tests in a second. I was thinking about this, this sort of attitudes and academic behaviours and so on. If I was doing this as a researcher, I could probably design, well, no, I wouldn't. I'd find someone who designed you a thing that's like, here's a validated measure so that I know exactly that I'm comparing Jimmy with Jane. But I imagine that you're not going to go down that route because it's kind of quite over the top within a classroom. But is it that there's like 3 or 4 things that you'd ask a teacher to prioritise? Imagine, for example, that I'm an NQT coming into your school in September. What advice would you give me about what to look for, how to look for the right things? Should I set up a task to test pupils' concentration? Should I just do what I normally do and observe? Should I take notes? Like, what should I be thinking about?
One of the things is how long they persist on a task. So say you gave them a maths problem and you always get some children that go, I can't do it before even reading it. So how long would they persist if they're finding it difficult? Or what would, if they are finding it difficult, what strategies have they got to try a different method? So it's about those, I don't know if it's resilience or being able to do it for themselves rather than relying on an adult. I don't think I'd do anything around concentration because children can look like they're concentrating and their mind's completely somewhere else, But I think it's got to be around those, if they get stuck, what do they do? That's what I would like. So I'd like to maybe some quite challenging activities so that children, they're not going to do it straight away because it always amazes me, actually, the most resilient children. I know growth mindset's a little bit, people don't think it's as good as it, but I do think there is a place for it. And the SEN children have usually got a much better growth mindset than the more academically able children because they're used to struggling, they're used to having to try hard. So it's things like that I'm interested in and seeing, because some of our children that find learning easier, you give them a hard task and they give up very quickly. Yeah. And I can imagine if they've been sat at home and their mum's been pretty doing the projects for them or whatever, it's going to be really, that's the kind of things I'm going to be asking people to look out for and observing and just can they answer in more than one word? Can they give you that sentence and build on their ideas? Or if somebody says something, can they build on that idea? So that it's that kind of thing I'll be looking at, getting the NQTs to really look at their questioning and the children's sentences when they reply and
Yeah, so my part B is I'm an NQT. I've started looking at this stuff and I've noticed that 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 7 or 8 of my children are struggling with one of these behaviours. should I pull them out? Should I give them the TA? Should I keep them behind? Is there going to be like a catch-up curriculum? Like, what do you think is a good way to approach this?
I think it's going to have to come down to the teachers' modelling and the teachers' their own modelling of the behaviour they want to see. What teachers in the early years are really good at is showing the children, this is what a sentence might look like or something, and then they'll go off and then in the moment they'll watch how the children are responding to it, and then they'll go in and sort of like help them that way. But their explanations are also very clear and very simple, and so that the children can grasp it and can retain it and things. I think that's the kind of thing we're going to have to be doing as teachers. We're going to be having to model this behaviour is what I expect. If I get stuck, this is what I can do. These are the things I can try.
So when as the NQT, you're not saying set up a separate mini class in persistence. It's potentially some of your professional development or the ongoing coaching that you're offering your colleagues and helping them just to be a little bit more effective within the same classroom and everyone else is getting on. Lovely. Okay. Yeah, I can definitely buy that. So accepting that academic behaviours and attitudes and so on are your priority, and that you don't want to go down a hot housing route, which I completely understand. What should your NQT be doing about actually assessing how much pupils have forgotten that you would ordinarily hope they bring into the next school year or whatever it is?
Well, I think that's when we can look at the curriculum content and then what we expect children to have known at the end of, say, year 5. This is what and then we can actually start. You can do some assessment around. I don't want to do massive long SATs mocks and stuff like that, but you can, before you introduce a new topic, then in maths, actually, what do they know already, so that we start at the right point, or I can match my teaching or scaffold my teaching. So there will be opportunities for assessment, because all teaching has got to be based on assessment, as far as I'm concerned. It's a prerequisite, and before you even plan it, assess it. So doing a lot of that retrieval practice and things like that. What do the children remember, so that you can actually then think through, this is what they need to do now. I think the maths might not have slipped as much as other subjects, because I think maths where there's been more of a mastery approach and children haven't been being pushed on too quickly, their basic arithmetic was more secure. So I'm hoping that the arithmetics, we'll be able to sort of build on what because they spent longer on learning things well, rather than trying to cover everything at once.
So they've spent long enough reinforcing it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I've been told about one bit of research that suggests that math suffers more because you don't do as much, like you keep doing speaking and listening at home. But all will be revealed in due course. And so is it fair for me that if I paraphrase what you're saying, it's basically just good teaching, right? It's like effective teaching involves knowing what pupils have done previously. Okay, so let's continue my sort of mini role play. I'm an NQT, I'm a little bit skeptical, and I'm just saying, well, in that case, I'm not going to do anything extra at all. I'm just going to do what I would have done anyway. Could I get away with that?
No, because we know.
Okay. What's going to make it different from what I'd have done every other year?
I think there's going to be more senior teachers with more experience are going to have to be working alongside, doing a lot more support. There's going to be a lot more. I think planning is going to already, our CPD for the summer 2 or whatever is basically, we're going to be doing, it's around planning and what does good planning look like. And but it's also about knowing what we said to people is, because we've got core books for our English curriculum. So we said to people, rather than just picking them up the week you're going to start planning them, actually over the next 6 weeks, read these books, know them really well, think about the opportunities you've got for writing, for all sorts of stuff from those books. So for me, it's about giving those NQTs additional support to plan effectively, to think about the sequence of learning the children need, the coaching that we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing online coaching. Because I do feel for my NQTs, they've only had half a year, haven't they?
Yeah.
So they're not. I'm glad the early careers framework's come out, because it's actually give them that time to consolidate. So there'll be a lot of extra support for anybody that's less experienced. But also, knowing that we can take our time, and there is no point hoping that we can just pull children up to where they should have been at the end of this year. And if our stats results take a dip next year because of it, then that's fine. I'd rather children left school with secure things in certain things than just getting age expected in their stats. I mean, that's the goal, that we get them there. But if we don't, if they take a dip, then that's my problem, not the NQT's problem.
Yeah, and a national issue, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so as your NQT, sceptical or otherwise, I definitely buy all that. Is there anything that we've not talked about that you think is important?
I think the role of support staff in this. So one of the things that, because my schools, they're going to be coming into school 1 day a week. So what I've done is I've looked at where their strengths are and where their weaknesses, and one of their areas that a lot of them aren't great at is maths. So I've been sending them sort of links to online CPD they can do around maths, because I do think that we are going to need support staff that actually understand the subject as well, because they are going to be crucial. There will be some children that maybe do need to go into a small group just to do some catch up, and some of our more able kids, getting them are higher achieving kids, so they're not being frustrated by being held back. So I think the role of support staff in making sure that we do quality intervention when we do intervention. So if we do need to do intervention, it's not just nonsense, it's actually meaningful and it's useful.
Thank you very much to all three of my sort of panelists there. It's now my chance to start picking up on some of the things that have come in, and then I'm going to introduce one more bit of insight at the end. One thing that I really loved from Jo's talk is her focus on the nuts and bolts of effective teaching, but without it's very easy when you're introduced to some sort of pedagogical innovation to have a kind of, oh, that's just good teaching, and that's what we all do already. And she's not saying that everything's perfect. She's saying, look, that there are certain things. I'm not going to ask my NQTs to replan 15 different lessons for 15 different pupils. I am going to make sure that we're focusing on the things that we know are really effective in the classroom. I also really like the way she brought in actually this is a professional development question. How are we making sure that our teachers are managing the things that matter most? Another thing to draw out that some of you've commented on in the question and answer is this importance of student well-being and the importance of holding these two things together in tension, and saying, we want to make sure that the school is a welcoming place, and we know they've been through a lot, and so on. And it is also our job to try and make sure that we are helping them to learn the things they come to school to learn. And it's really interesting how both heads who we've heard from have tried to say, both of these are really important. Both of them are core functions of the school, rather than an either or. Two questions I want to speak to before I draw in the last person we're going to hear from. First was a question that said, are we at risk of overvaluing what assessment can do? Are we reading too much into assessment? And I think my take on this would be, assessment is core to everything we do, because we know that what students learn is unpredictable, and students come to class with misconceptions and then find new ways of misinterpreting the things that we try to teach them. But they've now had this period where some of them have learned loads, some of them have learned really different stuff, and so assessment is probably even more important than it ever is. Second question said, is there a way that we could get students to do some of this themselves? I think there's some traction to that. If we say, okay, when students whenever you want to get them to do it, doesn't matter. Maybe it's day 4 because you spent the first 3 days coming back together as a school community, I don't know. But getting them to do like a sort of, here's a RAG rating of the things that you did or didn't understand. My concern about this would be, we know that learners are often quite poor at self-assessing, and I'm sure everyone on this call has seen the student who's like, yeah, tick, 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 I know all of those inside out, and then you give them an actual quiz and turns out they don't. So if we're looking, I think if student self-assessment is probably quite a nice way of doing it, but I'd want to base it on concrete questions rather than their own self-perception. So like, here's a 20-question quiz, here are the answers, how many did you get right? Might be a really nice way of doing things. Going to draw in one final perspective, which comes from someone who emailed me earlier this week, knowing that this webinar was coming up, and it's John Etty, who's a Director of Teaching and Learning at a school in New Zealand. And New Zealand, of course, way ahead of us in many ways, and their schools have reopened. And so I asked him, what have you done, and what do you wish you'd done? And one of the key points that he made speaks to this thing of like, how much do we value assessment? And he said, look, there are easy ways to quantify the size of the gaps. We can say students have missed this many weeks or whatever it is, but it's much harder to understand where the gaps are. This seems banal, but it's key, because although we know there will be gaps, all the students' gaps are in different places. Some kept up with work for a few weeks, then faltered. Some had a holiday for a month, then tried to catch up. Some checked in and did a bit of work every few days, but missed bits in between. Others chose their favourite subjects or challenging subjects and worked on those while ignoring others. And the issue is that the pattern is different for every student, and it's a pattern that's difficult to detect when your evaluation methods have to be gentle and unintrusive and quick to conduct. And so I think that really reinforces this idea that assessment is probably going to be even more important than it ordinarily is. It says, kind of understand what are the causes of the gap. Is it a gap that emerged during lessons? Is it to do with our teaching? Is it a gap that emerged because they skipped some online work we set? Really tricky. One thing he said that they did before school reopened was to get an early indication of where the problem was likely to be. And so what they did was produce low stakes online quizzes for students to complete before they came back. So that's one thing, depending on how much contact you've had with your students, that's one thing that you could ask them to do. He's highlighted the issue of learning and performance and saying, the assumption, the trap we quite often fall into is assuming that because people have done something or they've performed well once, they've learned it. And the issue is that actually students did some work, whether they did some revision, they feel confident about it, but they don't remember as much as you would hope. So using lots of low stake quizzes in one form or another, targeted at key ideas and key misconceptions. And then the last thing that he mentioned that I want to highlight is this balance between holding students accountable for trying to keep up with work, checking what they've learned and being sensitive and not causing further stress and anxiety, and saying, it's not impossible that some students would some students may have been in a really tricky situation. Other students may, play up how tricky things have been to avoid doing something that might need them to do. So trying to keep those two things in tension. I'm now going to have a look at a few more of your questions. The Kerry, who's the person who introduced this idea of RAG rating, says that it's often helpful to ask students how they feel about answering an essay question and get a sense of their thought process. So that's another useful way of getting their subjective opinion. Eddie says, look, use Google Forms in order to give yourself, in order to create low stakes diagnostic quizzes, and then they self-mark. So that gives you a good snapshot of how students are doing and minimizes your workload. And Emma has said, how would a recovery curriculum look in practice, and how can teachers prepare for this? And my take on it, obviously this is a really hard question to answer until we know more about how things are going to look in terms of exams and school reopening and so on. But my take would be, if you imagine a bridge, like students got up to March having learnt some but not all of what we hoped we'd teach them up to March. They've then forgotten differential amounts, and we now need them to be ready for the start of the next academic year, whatever it is. So the question is like, how do we create the bridge that goes in between those two things? And I think the answer has to be something like picking out the most important things from all three of those points, but with the key question in our mind being, what do they need in order to be ready for year 12, year 10, year 8, rather than what are all the things we wish we taught them, or what are the most interesting bits. And so again, I think this takes us back to our curricular thinking. And if we're sitting down as a team now, it's okay, going back to all the thinking that we do ordinarily, what are the aspects of the curriculum that are most important? What are the concepts that are going to come up again and again and again as across the years? And those are the things that we need to most ensure that students have understood in order to get into the next academic year. So I'm going to have to stop us there. Firstly, thank you so much to everyone who's joined us, taking time on, you probably heard the ice cream van outside my window. A beautiful day. Thank you very much for joining us on it. Huge thank you to Joe, to Janice and to Daisy for sharing their perspectives, and particularly for Janice and Joe, you know, very much went into that saying we don't have all the answers, and we're going to talk it through, and sharing that in public is bold, but I think is important. So thank you very much to them. A few opportunities you might want to think about. First, follow-up reading will be sharing a few things related to this topic on the Ambition website and the Twitter account over the next few days, so feel free to check those out. Second, so Joe Riley, the primary head teacher, is one of our Teacher Education Fellows, and Teacher Education Fellows is a 2-year programme designed to help teacher educators get even better. So if you want the chance to learn from and with a small group of teachers who are obsessed about how they help their colleagues get better, place to go. Our current fellows, alongside what they ordinarily do, have developed a lot of expertise about helping teachers get better remotely, so it's as relevant now as it ever has been. This year's cohort is going to launch in early July. Applications close on June the 16th. This is your last chance until summer 2021. Sign up now. Another programme relevant to what we're talking about today supports heads of department. It's called Expert Middle Leaders, 2 years long, basically does what it says on the tin, helps you become an expert middle leader, fully funded by the DFE, only 500 places, many of which have already gone. So the deadline for that is 2nd of July, get started. And then finally, today's session is just one of what we're calling the summer series, where we are bringing in different experts every week to share their expertise and things that we think are going to be useful to schools. We're taking a week's break for what would have been half term next week, but on the 3rd of June there's some guy called Peps McRae who will be leading a session on motivating pupils when schools reopen. Highly recommend it. But thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and do go and see the sunshine.